and apologies for the cool weather, excessively cool weather. Well, we are here. We are going to resume now this panel. We'll deal with a question that was obviously mentioned repeatedly today. Energy, and the question is, can Brazil and the U.S. become partners in the field of energy? You have had, different slices of this issue. We will hear from 5 very well-informed people that have worked on this for a while. From different institutions. First, Marcel Zimmermann. He is the Deputy Minister of Mines and Energy in Brazil, working with Minister Edison Lobão. And I'm particularly grateful that he made the trip from Brasilia to be with us today. I am not going to read everybody's bios. They're here. You guys, please go ahead and read them. Next, we are going to hear from Joe Velasco, a dear friend of mine who has worked for the U.S. government and has been for almost 2 years now, I think, the chief representative of Única, the ethanol, sugarcane ethanol industry in the state of São Paulo. We will proceed, I think, in this order. After Joel, we will hear from Eduardo Pereira de Carvalho. Eduardo was, until a couple of years ago, the president of Única, and in that capacity he came here, he visited us, and he had a very interesting conversation with environmentalists, and it was in the a few months after I started here at the Institute, and so it's a pleasure to welcome Eduardo back. He is now a senior executive at ETH Bioenergy, a company that is part of the Odebrecht Group. Then I will ask 2 friends of the Brazil Institute, both from the U.S. Congress, Jason Steinbaum, staff director of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Western Hemisphere, where he works with Chairman Elliot Engel, very interested in this issue of energy cooperation in Brazil. And last but not least, Carl Mitchum, who is senior staff in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where he worked with Senator Richard Lugar from Indiana in trying to make the Memorandum of Understanding on biofuels that Presidents Bush and Lula signed in March of 2007 in São Paulo, try to make that sort of, to give some operational characteristics to that. It's still pending in Congress. I personally hope that the senator will continue to reintroduce that legislation in the next Congress. Senator Lugar, as Congress Chairman Engel, are really important players, and I think important friends of Brazil in this. So we will hear first from Vice Minister Marcel Zimmermann, and proceed in the order that I introduced the speakers. Minister.
Tá.
Boa tarde a todos. Gostaria de cumprimentar o Paulo Sotério e agradecer aí pelo convite, dando a oportunidade para que o Ministério de Minas e Energia, através de mim, pudesse dar a contribuição, e principalmente num tema que é muito interessante, que é muito atual. Hoje de manhã mesmo nós tivemos a oportunidade de ver duas posições bastante interessantes, a do embaixador Clifford, Sobel, o entusiasmo que ele tem da relação, da expectativa favorável que ele tem, da expectativa com relação a esse relacionamento Brasil e Estados Unidos, nas diversas áreas, e ao mesmo tempo a franqueza que lhe é peculiar, o ministro Jobim com toda a sua experiência, mas ao mesmo tempo com a sua objetividade, no sentido de que, se nós quisermos avançar, efetivamente tem que começar falando com a devida franqueza. Eu acho que quando você traz o assunto, como pode evoluir o assunto energia, um maior intercâmbio entre Brasil e Estados Unidos, já que são países que têm uma tradição aí de séculos de excelente relacionamento, chama atenção que na área de energia nós vivemos um momento interessante e é importante que a gente primeiro tenta aquilo que foi falado aqui de manhã sobre talvez até o desconhecimento que um país tem pelo outro. Talvez seja importante nós observarmos quem é esse Brasil que está vindo aqui hoje, que está discutindo diversas áreas, e assuntos tão importantes como energia. Nós estamos falando de um país que hoje é a 9ª economia do mundo, estamos numa situação aí com um PIB de 1,79 trilhões de dólares. Claro que aqui ninguém não vou discorrer sobre a crise que o mundo vive hoje, mas o Brasil, num momento, como todos os países que estão sendo afetados aí por essa crise, mas de qualquer forma ele tem determinadas características que eu vou tentar mostrar aqui, que são importantes quando nós tentamos entender o setor de energia no Brasil. Esse país, ele tem uma característica também, o país continental, que também já foi falado aqui, são características que aproximam, né, tanto pelo aspecto da formação dos Estados Unidos, também a formação do Brasil, o embaixador comentou, europeu, africano, europeu latino e anglo-saxão. Na verdade, nós tivemos então uma formação muito parecida. E esses países que têm tamanho, que têm um PIB acima de 1 trilhão, que têm mais de 6 milhões de quilômetros quadrados, e uma população aí de mais de 180 milhões de habitantes, aí você só fala em 4 países no mundo, que é Estados Unidos, China, Brasil e Rússia. Isso nos coloca, claro, com um desafio de pensarmos que, efetivamente, você está falando de economias, no nosso caso, em desenvolvimento, mas que já tem um consumo de energia e uma capacidade instalada para gerar energia, para produção de energia, bastante interessante, aproximando aí de países tipo França, Inglaterra e outros desenvolvidos. É um país que também nos chama a atenção pela diversidade de opções que tem para atender às suas demandas energéticas. É um país que tem uma característica bem interessante porque ele tem uma matriz muito renovável. E isso é no momento que se fala em aquecimento global, nós estamos falando de alguém que trabalha com uma matriz, um país que trabalha com 45% da sua matriz renovável. Um país que, comparando com o mundo hoje tem trabalhado aí da ordem de 12%, 13% a sua matriz energética, que inclui energia elétrica e combustíveis, é somente isso renovável. E quando falamos dos Estados Unidos, somente 5% é renovável. É um país que quer continuar com essa matriz e tem perspectiva de continuar. A hidroeletricidade ocupou um espaço bom e ocupa ainda para a geração de energia, mas algo novo apareceu, que é o etanol. O etanol que já há mais de 30 anos o Brasil vem trabalhando com isso, em função justamente daquelas famosas crises do petróleo, né? E que forçou o país, na época era um grande importador de petróleo, a trabalhar com essa alternativa. E que hoje é um sucesso reconhecido mundialmente, como algo que pode contribuir efetivamente para o aquecimento global e, por outro lado, cria oportunidades de parceria, como essa que está ocorrendo já de alguma forma com os Estados Unidos, e que tem passos interessantes para frente e que já estão sendo dados. Quando nós pensamos, a indústria de petróleo, são 20 países que produzem petróleo no mundo. Quando nós falamos em biocombustível, nós facilmente chegaremos a 100 ou passaremos de 100, que tem perspectivas. E perspectivas, como foi dito aqui, sem afetar a parte de produção de alimentos. Mas são países como o Brasil e Estados Unidos que podem ajudar muito, países centro-americanos, como já ajudam, africanos, entre nós levarmos, como alguns, levarmos uma eólica, um painel solar para o meio da África, instalarmos lá e acharmos que estamos resolvendo o problema de energia da África, é muito mais fácil você levar esse tipo de tecnologia e agregar valor em alguma coisa que vai ser produzido lá, e que você tem condições de resgatar populações que trabalham num patamar aí de consumo de energia baixíssimo. Se hoje nós temos Estados Unidos com consumo da ordem de energia elétrica da ordem de 12, 13 mil kWh per capita, o Brasil hoje trabalha com 2.000, e países da África a média deve ser 300, 400 kWh per capita. Quando nós falamos em consumo per capita de energia, nós sabemos que de alguma forma nós vamos agregar ao longo do tempo essas camadas menos desassistidas no consumo. Às vezes dizem, não, mas se o biocombustível não vai ter espaço. Quando nós olhamos num país como o nosso, você enxerga, já foi falado aqui, mas é a grande perspectiva que você tem do petróleo no pré-sal. E aí logo vem a pergunta, bom, mas com o pré-sal vocês vão esquecer biocombustível? Eu acredito que não tem nada uma coisa a ver com outra. Nós vamos desenvolver o pré-sal, é prioridade do país, mas biocombustível também é uma grande prioridade do país. A demanda que o mundo vai ter, e o importante é que quando nós chegamos num ponto onde o país pode consumir praticamente mais etanol do que gasolina, como o ano de 2008, o Brasil está atingindo isso. Para veículos leves, o consumo de etanol ultrapassou o consumo de gasolina. E isso ocupando só 0,5% da área do Brasil. Ou seja, você está falando em 4 milhões de hectares. E que você tem 170 que usa para pecuária, e que tem da ordem de 70, 90 de terras que não estão sendo utilizadas. Isso tirando os 5 milhões de quilômetros quadrados que você não considera, pega a parte dos biomas principais, Amazônia, Pantanal, e mais área já ocupada por cidades. E você tem, então, uma área muito grande para a produção de etanol, sem comprometer nada a produção de alimento. Muito antes, pelo contrário. Outro ponto que nós achamos importante chamar a atenção aqui, nesses aspectos de possibilidade de incremento de parceria, algumas já indo bem, nós tivemos uma oportunidade do seminário, de um congresso mundial que ocorreu no Brasil, há 2, 3 semanas atrás, de biocombustível. E foi uma grata surpresa a participação de 95 países. Mandaram delegações e participação de quase 40 ministros de energia do mundo inteiro, e onde se fez uma discussão bastante interessante. Então, se nós temos aqui os Estados Unidos, que é o maior produtor de etanol do mundo, nós temos o Brasil, que é o segundo maior, e você tem potencialidade de estender isso para o mundo, é claro que é uma excelente oportunidade de Brasil e Estados Unidos continuarem fortemente com essa parceria, trabalhando para que você consiga adotar padrões de etanol a nível mundial e desenvolver, criando as condições para quando nós tivermos o etanol de segunda geração, mais democrático ainda, que praticamente todos os países do mundo vão ter a oportunidade de produzir, nós já teremos então um mercado funcionando bastante forte. Eu vou citar, além dessa parte de etanol, que eu sei que temos especialistas na mesa e que vão abordar o assunto aí com bastante competência, tem parcerias que nós enxergamos como bastante positiva ainda na parte nuclear. Quando nós olhamos, o ministro Jobim hoje falou do submarino movido a propulsão nuclear, né? Mas o Brasil tem, hoje, ele tem mais ou menos em torno, por exemplo, na área de energia, produção de energia elétrica, nós temos algo em torno de 104, 105 mil megawatts. Quando nós olhamos nos nossos planos de longo prazo, nós vimos que nós precisamos acrescentar até 2030 algo em torno de 125 mil megawatts. É mais do que dobrar o que nós temos hoje. Aí você pode pensar, mas vocês não estão pensando em eficiência energética? Vocês não estão... Não, é que um país em desenvolvimento que tem um consumo per capita nesse patamar de 2000 e uma sociedade que vem sendo incorporada, principalmente nos últimos anos, você ampliou a classe média, você está levando energia elétrica a toda a população brasileira, é natural, e com as perspectivas de crescimento que você tem, que ocorra aquilo que não é diferente do que ocorreu no passado. De 1970 até 2000 e pouco, nós tivemos um crescimento do consumo de energia elétrica da ordem de 4,7%, quase 5%, independente de termos tido 2 décadas com baixo crescimento econômico. Então nos abre o desafio para frente de que nós precisamos aumentar a capacidade instalada para geração de energia. Essa capacidade, hoje o Brasil é um país basicamente, né, que praticamente 90% da energia elétrica que produz é geração hidrelétrica, mas que pretende continuar explorando, como disse bem o ministro Jobim aqui de manhã. Nós temos um grande potencial a explorar na Amazônia, e o Brasil pretende explorar. E pretende explorar de uma forma onde você mitigue os desafios ambientais, que você consiga implantar as usinas naquela parte do Brasil, a exemplo do que estamos agora implantando em Santo Antônio e as usinas de Santo Antônio e Geral em Rondônia, e vamos levar a leilão o ano que vem a usina de Belo Monte no Rio Xingu, e em 2010 as usinas do Rio Tapajós, acrescentando aí 30, 40 mil megawatts só em cima dessas usinas. São grandes aproveitamentos que você tem. Uma característica que nos leva a viabilizar isso é que você consegue produzir energia lá, você consegue minimizar esse impacto e, ao mesmo tempo, você consegue trazer energia e com preços competitivos, mesmo com transmissão em longa distância, onde o Brasil é um país que evoluiu muito. Diferente da característica aqui americana, onde é um sistema muito térmico, né? E com poucas integrações fortes aí de elétrica, no Brasil nós tivemos que desenvolver, já que as usinas eram longe da carga, isso fortemente. Para atingirmos essa capacidade, esses planos já mostram a necessidade de você aumentar o parque nuclear. Então nós sabemos que os Estados Unidos é um dos países que tem o maior número de centrais nucleares no mundo. E isso é claro que abre oportunidade. O Brasil agora voltou a continuar a construção agora da sua terceira planta nuclear, que é a Angra 3, mas pretende, está sendo discutida a nível de governo, uma ampliação para até 2030, imaginamos algo em torno de 4 a 8 centrais. Isso é uma visão de hoje. E isso significa que é outro campo grande, tanto no aspecto de quais adequações que nós temos que fazer no nosso marco legal, mas abre uma oportunidade de participação de outros países no desenvolvimento desse parque no Brasil. Por outro lado, essa parte de petróleo, que também hoje, tanto no setor elétrico como no setor de petróleo, o Brasil é um dos países que mais atrai investimento estrangeiro nessas áreas. E tudo isso graças a um marco regulatório estável e um marco que dá segurança. Eu comentava que ainda outro dia nós recebíamos a visita lá do presidente do grupo mundial do Grupo Suez, e eles participam ativamente na área de geração no Brasil, a exemplo de grupos americanos que estão participando lá, mas eles com muito interesse, se esse marco regulatório que vocês têm no setor elétrico for estendido dessa forma para nuclear, eles são os primeiros candidatos a participarem disso. Então, no setor de energia elétrica, o Brasil aprendeu que ter um marco estável é importantíssimo para atrair investimento. E é política desse governo e é o que vem sendo feito. Na outra parte de petróleo, a estabilidade desse marco fez que hoje nós tenhamos praticamente 79, 80 empresas estrangeiras atuando nas 3 áreas aí, produção, refino e distribuição, no Brasil. É claro que esse setor, ele tem um impacto novo, que é o pré-sal, né? Ainda no almoço fizeram uma pergunta se o pré-sal com esse petróleo ele se sustenta. Na verdade, todos os projetos da Petrobras, eles só passam no comitê de negócio ou na diretoria se eles se sustentarem com petróleo com um barril a $35. E o pré-sal se encaixa nisso. Então é claro que nós sabemos, hoje o petróleo Brent, eu acho que chegou em 40 e poucos dólares, né, por barril. Então, enquanto nós sabemos que no mundo, outros países, por exemplo, provavelmente Venezuela, Canadá, ou produção no Ártico não se sustentam, já com esse patamar de 40 e pouco, né? No pré-sal, a expectativa é que você consiga, né? E isso, é claro, vai colocar um desafio para a sociedade brasileira, de tanto adequar você passar de um país que tinha uma reserva, que agora com essas primeiras reservas aprovadas do pré-sal já duplicou, nós tínhamos 14, já fomos para 28 bilhões de barris, e fora os outros que vêm em andamento, a análise dessa camada que é muito grande, é 800 quilômetros por 200, né, no litoral brasileiro, nos coloca esse desafio de grandes investimentos que se tem que fazer e com impacto em toda a indústria nacional. O impacto na indústria naval é um crescimento enorme que nós já estamos tendo. São a construções de plataformas, navios, e tudo isso coloca uma necessidade grande. Por isso que o governo, com toda a crise, ele prioriza os investimentos que são necessários do pré-sal. Até porque tem áreas do pré-sal com possibilidade de retorno muito rápido, com possibilidade já dos testes de produção evoluir e você já ter produção em 2010 mais forte. Esse aspecto todo que você trata com relação ao marco regulatório aí do pré-sal é natural. Um país que descobre potenciais de reserva desse porte tem que pensar para que não ocorra lá o que ocorreu em outros países, onde o petróleo, a famosa maldição do petróleo, né, que em vez de virar uma grande bonança para o seu povo, acaba virando uma maldição. Então o Brasil tem a maturidade para entender que a exploração do pré-sal ela tem que ser feita de uma forma bastante consciente, de que não venha a provocar um processo de desindustrialização do país ou coisa parecida. Então, com isso, é toda a discussão que nós temos hoje sobre o pré-sal é isso, sobre que marco, que adequações no marco para aquela área específica que você já sabe que tem uma quantidade bastante grande, respeitando quem já está na área, que é uma característica aí que o Brasil tem praticado muito, que é o respeito aos contratos existentes, né? De forma que você consiga atingir o melhor para a sociedade brasileira, mas sempre pensando de que nós só vamos conseguir atrair investidores, como os atraímos hoje no setor elétrico e no setor do petróleo. Você tem que achar esse ponto de equilíbrio se você tem um marco regulatório que consiga atrair, que dê a segurança para o investidor externo vir para o país. E são bem-vindos, como tem sido aí observado o dinamismo que esses diversos setores da economia brasileira na parte de energia têm ocupado. Por último, seria interessante fazer um comentário para finalizar, de que o desenvolvimento, o país em desenvolvimento, no momento que o mundo passa essa crise que tem passado, força o governo a tomar decisões importantíssimas no sentido de você, aproveitando as características que o Brasil tem, cada país está pensando da sua forma, mas a necessidade que nós temos de ampliar a nossa infraestrutura, que conforme foi citado aqui de manhã, já apresentava alguns gargalos bastante fortes. A importância de nós mantermos os investimentos dentro do programa de aceleração do crescimento, que no fundo é um programa que está melhorando e ampliando a infraestrutura brasileira, que é uma coisa chave para que você possa continuar crescendo. Garantir os investimentos no pré-sal, e tudo isso de forma que você consiga, então, minimizar ou tornar o menos pesado os impactos que essa crise está causando e pode causar muito mais no mundo inteiro. Então, dessa forma, senhores, nós achamos que Brasil e Estados Unidos, pelas características que tem, a longa história de amizade que tem, de relacionamento, e, por outro lado, as afinidades que tem de características e de potenciais áreas de sinergia que existe na parte energética, me coloca na mesma posição do embaixador Clifford Sobel, de ser bastante otimista quanto ao futuro desse relacionamento e dessa integração na área energética. Muito obrigado.
Good afternoon. It's good to be here and good to see so many friendly faces in the audience. I'm going to try to be pretty brief for simple reason that I think we want to get to some Q&As, and also the guy who's the real expert on ethanol in Brazil is speaking after me, Eduardo Carvalho. And two dear friends from Capitol Hill are also speaking after me, so I'm just going to try to maybe warm up the audience a little bit. Meanwhile, apparently this is going to warm up too. For those who don't know, UNICA is the Brazilian Sugarcane Industry Association, and we represent about 60% of all the sugar and ethanol that's produced in Brazil today. And I'm going to try to talk only about ethanol, though happy to talk about sugar. There's another area the United States and Brazil could cooperate in. But we're also major producers of electricity now. And just teeing off of what the minister pointed out earlier, about 2 to 3% of Brazil's electricity demand today is actually met as from sugarcane. It's a byproduct of our mills. We're selling about 3,000 average megawatts into the grid today. By year, I think 2012, Eduardo can correct me, we'll probably be selling about 10,000 average megawatts to the grid, if not more. The reality is we probably have about what Three Gorges Dam did last year in Brazil right now from the sugarcane, and that's just as a byproduct. I'm not sure how many of you are going to be able to see this, but just roughly my very brief outline of what I want to talk about. The industry today, I was already highlighting that. Some of the lessons that I think Brazil has to offer to the United States in terms of building energy security. Key element there, I think, is that, in my view, and I think the view of the other panelists most likely, is that the road to energy independence is through diversification, not isolation. And then finally, really, this concept of trying to build world markets for biofuels. Why we want this from the perspective of UNICA, and why we think the United States should want some of this too. So very briefly, I've already talked to you about UNICA, so I'll pass through this. Just to teeing off of what the minister pointed out earlier, if you take a look at Brazil's entire energy matrix, you'll see, as of last year, about 45% of all of Brazil's energy, this is electricity, fuel for cars and so forth, is renewable. And what happened last year was something remarkable, was that for the first time, sugarcane, both as a fuel for cars but also for electricity, became the #1 source of renewable energy in Brazil, surpassing hydroelectricity, which, as the minister pointed out, represents about 80% of Brazil's electricity power generation. Only about a third of Brazil's energy today is fossil-based. If you're a Washingtonian, this is what I'm a Democrat, but this is what Republicans love to say is all of the above. When they've been drilling in Brazil, they've been doing renewables, they've been doing various sorts of renewables, and then been also, I would say, as the minister knows, working on efficiency. And if you want any evidence of that, try the 2000 energy rationing in Brazil, 20% drop in consumption without major repercussions. But our industry today, we produce 3 products. Ethanol, we'll produce about 6 billion gallons of ethanol this year. By comparison, the U.S. will produce about close to 9.5 billion gallons. If you like to keep it in liters, it's about 26 billion liters in Brazil. We'll produce about 31 million metric tons of sugar. That makes Brazil the world's largest sugar producer. And then, as I pointed out, we're selling electricity into the grid, so we'll sell about 3,000 average megawatts this year. But the future is very bright for our industry. It's one of the reasons we're so excited about it. We've been making sugar in Brazil for many years. We've been making ethanol and now electricity, but we got some other molecules coming in. One that I think Eduardo's group can talk a little bit about is making basically plastics, making ethylene out of the ethanol to then make PET. And then later, I believe we're also going to be making hydrocarbons, both in Brazil, but also helping other governments and other states do this. I see some representatives from the U.S. Air Force. The Brazilian industry is working with the government of Alabama to grow cane in Alabama to then convert that cane juice into jet fuel for the U.S. Air Force. That's only being done because Brazil's been spending a lot of time and energy in developing better varieties of sugarcane that are not available in the U.S. And if you want to know why they're not available in the U.S., just look at the U.S. sugar program. Briefly, why we love sugarcane ethanol right now, it's pretty simple. You can make a lot of it with very little land. We get about 800 gallons of ethanol from sugarcane right now on average in Brazil. We get about nearly 9.5 units of energy out for every unit of fossil fuel input we put in. I'll let you figure out what the other feedstocks are and how well they do. But from a greenhouse gas reduction perspective, we have today in sugarcane ethanol what advanced biofuels, cellulosic ethanol, whatever you want to think of, will do in the future. We reduce greenhouse gases compared to baseline gasoline, really yesterday's gasoline, by 80% or more. In fact, according to an OECD report and some of the analysis we've done in Brazil, pretty soon we're actually going to reduce, on a life cycle basis, have a reduction of emissions so great from sugarcane ethanol that actually your car on a life cycle basis will be a carbon sink because we'll absorb more than 100%. Why is... You agree, right, Eduardo?
No.
If he disagrees, I know I'm in trouble. Why is energy security so important for us? And how can we try to find some elements, lessons from Brazil? Not everything Brazil has done has been right in this, the experience of 30 years. We've had a lot of mistakes. Luckily, I'm young, so I wasn't part of most of them. First, you've got to have a fuel. And in Brazil, where we grow the fuel is also extremely important. In Brazil, we grow the fuel about 2,000 kilometers or miles, 2,000 kilometers from the Amazon, south central Brazil, outside of the city of São Paulo. That's about 90% of all the cane is getting grown in Brazil. Why is it grown there? Because that's where it's good to grow in. That's where it grows well. And secondly, that's where the market is. And if you don't believe me and you think we're really probably just showing you pretty pictures, actually I think out of Eduardo's tenure at Única, they developed something called Canasat, which is working with the Brazilian government using government satellite imagery. And we can tell you where the cane is getting grown on a real time. And the reason, for those who love to talk about IPR, the reason the satellites were developed to do this in Brazil was because the industry as a whole would figure out cane varieties in Brazil, would develop new varieties. And Monsanto wasn't around. They hadn't figured out how to do royalty payments on sugarcane because there are no seeds. So to make sure, right, Eduardo, that nobody was cheating the system, they used satellite imagery, and they can tell what variety of cane is getting grown in any field in Brazil from satellite imagery. Now, if we can do that, we certainly can tell you that it's also not getting grown in the Amazon. So we've got the fuel, but we've got to have the infrastructure. And the infrastructure is a sort of broadly defined. First, you got to have the cars, and then you got to have a distribution system. The car, we've been working on it. I wasn't around, but apparently in the 1920s they ran ethanol in some very early cars in Brazil. But another sign of U.S.-Brazil cooperation in the U.S. Contribution to the Brazilian story, in the 1990s, a woman, picture there, called Roberta Nichols, patented the first flex fuel car in Brazil. If you can't tell, it was a Ford Taurus. The flex fuel car was invented primarily for California's methanol program. Brazilian industry, U.S. auto industry in Brazil and some others worked together, and Eduardo is probably the person who should give most credit for this, of getting the Brazilian automakers to produce flex fuel cars. We've got that. 90% of all new cars sold in Brazil today are flex fuel. But we also have to be able to distribute this fuel. So we've got pipelines thanks to Petrobras, and we'll build some more. We've got every gas station, fuel station in Brazil sells ethanol and gasoline and a lot of times natural gas. And you can have the choice at the pump of what fuel you want to put in. In fact, thanks to the good work in the last few years, since 2003, we've sold probably over 6 million flex fuel cars in Brazil. Every automaker from GM to VW to the Honda Civic and the Toyota Corolla are flex fuel in Brazil today. And guess what? More important, and this is something that already starts becoming very different than the U.S. Our flex fuel cars actually run on flex fuels. In other words, they run on either ethanol or gasoline, and most of the time ethanol. 80% of the time today, the cars are being run on ethanol that are flex fuel. Why? because of this very simple chart that I actually made for Congressman Ed Markey, who was in Brazil, and says, I can't figure out the prices at the pump. You got too many prices. Can you explain to me what happens? I said, so this is charting the price of ethanol and gasoline in Brazil over 2007 throughout the country. You don't have to be very smart to figure out that gasoline is about twice the price of ethanol. If you have a flex fuel car, guess what? You'll do that. And even if somebody tells you that a flex fuel car, if running on ethanol, is going to have to get worse mileage, you say, okay, fine, so I have to stop at the gas station every 5 days instead of every 6 days to refuel. Big deal. I saved so much money, I can buy 2 cars now. Second thing about prices is that you have to compete with gasoline. As pointed out, you're cheaper. But gasoline also has to be competitive. This is if you charted price of ethanol. And by the way, Eduardo, I fixed it with the latest price changes. Price of ethanol at the bottom, price of gasoline, average price in Brazil. Oh, by the way, there's no gasoline in Brazil. There's the only closest thing we have to gasoline in Brazil is E25, which is a quarter ethanol in it. But what's interesting about this chart says the price of oil was raising through 2006, 2007, and part of this year. Gasoline prices weren't going up in Brazil. Now, for a long time, Brazil controlled gasoline prices because of inflation. But the reality is what happened was if they passed through the price increases of oil to gasoline, guess what would happen? They would sell less gasoline. You don't have to believe me. Ask the CEO of Petrobras, who's admitted as much recently. But we're still competitive. Look at what happened to the price of oil last few months. And price of gasoline is still pretty much the same. And price of ethanol, it's very low. Ask Eduardo. And the result has been the following. Today, gasoline is the alternative fuel in Brazil. We actually consume more ethanol than gasoline on a volume basis. Doesn't mean it's always going to be this way. It's a function of price. And we're okay with that. Because we can make sugar, electricity, plastics, and a bunch of other things. And you'll say, well, how are you doing this? You must be clearly doing something really bad for the environment or destroying habitats or maybe taking over soy fields. You can ask Governor Maggi about the soy fields, but last I checked, he still occupies 6% of Brazil's arable land. We, in sugarcane for ethanol, occupy 1% of Brazil's arable land. Think about it, 1% of Brazil's arable land to displace 50% of Brazil's gasoline consumption. The reality is if you really want to understand Brazilian agriculture and Brazilian land use, you have to understand pastures. It occupies 50% of Brazil's arable land. Put it another way, every head of cattle in Brazil occupies about 2.5 acres. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't have 2.5 acres to my name. But a cow in Brazil does. And so when we think about how to free up more land in Brazil, you have to think of how you can make cattle business more efficient. We're not talking about putting in feedlots and confining them in, a square foot. But you've got to think about how to do that. And because the only way we're going to sort of protect the Amazon is to make sure that cattle are a little bit more constrained than they are today. Very briefly, my final points. Beautiful story in Brazil, right? Well, the world today, only 1% of the world's liquid fuel supply is actually coming from renewable biofuels. Less than 1%. And in fact, if you look at the world trade of ethanol, only 10% is actually being traded outside of the country's borders. 9.9% of that is Brazil. And then you look at the United States, though, there's been a huge boom of ethanol. If you look, this map is basically telling you in green where backtrack. U.S., you can put 10% ethanol into gasoline. In green is where that 10% is filled up in 2007. Red, where there is absolutely no ethanol being used in gasoline. Look what happens from one year to the other. Ethanol starts getting consumed everywhere. Why? Not just because the government mandated it, but because ethanol was cheaper than gasoline. If you were a fuel blender, if you're a gasoline company, you'd be dumb not to put $1 or $1.50 ethanol in $3 gasoline. But then Congress came in about, in 2005, but really last year again, and came up with something called the Renewable Fuel Standard. I can talk to all you want about this, but in a nutshell, they said the government is going to mandate a certain volume of ethanol or biofuels be consumed in the gasoline supply in the United States. And this year, the mandate is for 9 billion gallons, and by 2022, it will be 36 billion gallons. And if you paid attention, Senator Obama, now President-elect, has said that he'd like to take this to 60 billion gallons by year 2030. How? Many people don't know. Brazil is certainly hoping that they will have a slice of that pie. Simplify that a little bit. Yellow is the conventional biofuels, which is corn-based, and the thing above is so-called advanced biofuels, biofuels that reduce greenhouse gases emissions by at least 50%. Remember, sugarcane should participate in that in theory. But so Brazil's been trying to sell ethanol into the United States, and this is our exports from Brazil to the United States. And for those who think we never talk about this backdoor through the Caribbean, this data includes all the ethanol we bring in through the Caribbean. For those who don't know, we're allowed to import into the United States without paying the tariff of 54 cents, but we have to dehydrate in the Caribbean. And last I checked, we are always dehydrating with Hugo Chavez's oil. So instead of paying 54 cents to U.S. Treasury, pay 30 cents to Hugo Chavez to get his oil to dehydrate our ethanol. Go figure. But anyhow, we continue to do well. It's highly volatile business, but this year we think we'll ship about 650 million gallons to the United States. Ironically, the mandate's for 9 billion gallons. We work really hard to get about 600 million gallons in. Hugo Chavez made, I think, about $50 million probably out of that with his oil. And it costs a lot of money. You want to know why Brazilians and people like Eduardo get very upset, I would even say pissed, about the ethanol tariff? Just look at this. Since the beginning of the Iraq War, we have paid $524 million to U.S. Treasury for the tariff. Think about it. $500 million has been paid by Brazil to bring in a clean, renewable fuel since the beginning of the Iraq War. We've been fighting a war to free ourselves from oil, and we're taxing the poor Brazilians at about the rate of 30%. Now, I'm not saying you just completely say we're going to become dependent on Brazil, but that maybe this is probably not the best policy if you want to wean yourself off of Middle Eastern oil. So we've been very advocate. We got a website. We've done ad campaigns and things about this. Because we think if America wants to get to be energy independent, America needs to be more energy diversified. And that's at the crux of the issue. So we say when it comes to energy independence in the United States, the answer is no, because we're not diversified. We've decided that we'd rather be dependent on only Iowa and the Middle East than actually be diversified. Nothing wrong with corn ethanol. I will not criticize them. But the issue is, should they be allowed to have a little competition? This is what we think would happen if there were competition. In gray is the mandate between now and 2015. In orange is what we presume we'll ship regardless. So this year we shipped about 600 million gallons to the U.S. If nothing changed in U.S. policy, by 2015 we'll ship probably an average about $1 billion and a half to the United States. That's probably pretty conservative. If the tariff were just reduced to the level of the tax credit is 45 cents now, and the tax credit is 45 cents, the tariff is 54 cents. Senator Grassley says one is just supposed to offset the other. I've checked. Senator Grassley is not dyslexic, but somehow 54 is supposed to be an offset for 45. But then you go, so we would probably ship a little bit more, and so under parity would get to about 4 billion gallons by 2015. 4 billion gallons out of a market at that point that will be about 20 billion gallons mandated under the old law. We're not talking about Obama's proposal. And then if the tariff were actually removed, Brazil would ship somewhere around 6 billion gallons by 2015. People say, well, that's not a lot. We thought you were going to flood our market. I go talk to the guys in Brazil, says, guys, we produce 6 billion gallons right now. I need you to produce double that by 2015. They'll say that's a very tall order. But that's just if we just said we're just going to have open markets. We actually would be more energy secure, we'd have cleaner fuels, and we'd have, I think, a great partnership with the United States and Brazil in this area. And I think the world would have a lot more respect for these two countries when they talk about biofuels. So I'll end there. let my friends talk a little bit more, and I think Eduardo is going to give us some more specifics on this.
Eduardo, the floor is yours.
Tough act to follow, Eduardo.
Joel, you made my task here extremely easy. Especially being fluent on English is a fantastic advantage, as we were discussing with Antonio. And I wish I could speak English as my native language, because when I hear about those things, I become so pissed off. But I'm here to thank the center to the invitation and the opportunity to see so many friends again, and to talk a little about partnership in energy between Brazil and the United States under the new democratic administration. That's the thing. You can see here that we do have a lot to partner with the United States. We have a consistent experience on energy, renewable, for 30 years. Of course, we here talk about the good things. There were a lot of bad things under these 30 years. We have learned a lot. We have erred a lot. We paid a high price for that, especially the private industry that broke 2 times during these 30 years. But we are here to talk about partnership. I remember when President Bush was to go to Brazil to talk about partnership in energy, especially in biofuels. And I remember talking with our President Lula. And at that time I was at Unica. And I just asked our president if he was going to talk about tariffs, because I have talked with about a lot of people around the 2 presidents, and this issue should not be touched upon. It was impolite to talk about these things. But they were there to talk about partnership in bioenergy. But tariff was forbidden to be talked about. And we know why. I think Joel made clear why we cannot talk about tariff. And it's because the mature corn ethanol industry in the United States that is producing today 50% above what we are producing is still an infant industry that has to learn how to produce efficiently. Is that so? Certainly not. Certainly not. It's not inefficient per se. It's because you cannot compete with sugar cane. Sugar cane is the most fantastic machine that nature invented to capture energy out of the sun. The efficiency of sugar cane can only be compared with palm oil. And there are no other known vegetable that can compare with. And that's why our numbers are like this one. Now, there is a very important point when we talk about renewable energy. And I'm going to concentrate myself on renewable energy because that's what I do for a living. Supply security, number one. Can we cooperate? Can we partnership with supply security? Certainly, because supply security, in our view, is not isolation, is not independence, is not autarky. I have learned on your schools 40 years ago that autarky is the wrong way to proceed. I believe that still today. Churchill has said in a famous Daniel Yergens Prize, the book on the history of oil, that by 1912, when the British Navy was turning its fuel from coal to oil, because oil was a better way to have more speed and autonomy in its ships, because they were beginning to see Germany doing the same, he had to discuss as First Lord of the Admiralty. He was asked at the Parliament because he was giving up security, and he said, diversity and diversity alone are the name of security of supply. And they had coal inside England, and all the oil had to be imported elsewhere. If you want to have security, you have to have different alternatives, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 10. You have to have different sources of supply. And that's how you get at supply security. Can we collaborate on that? Can we have a partnership between Brazil and the United States on supply security? Certainly. Can we have environment security? Is it security from the environment point of view to produce ethanol that's energy balance is just a little 5 or 10% energy safe? Certainly not. See the numbers for sugarcane today. See the names for sugarcane tomorrow when we will be producing 10 or 15,000 megawatts of electricity out of the bagasse and leaves that we are going to burn efficiently, or we are burning efficiently. Environment security must be one of the most important elements of the new policies. And I understand President Obama has said that very clearly. So from the point of view of environment security, we do have something to bring to the partnership that I mentioned. Food security, no doubt about it. No doubt about it. And why that? We, through the use of sugarcane, we are not using land for food production. On the contrary, whereas we are producing sugarcane, we are producing additional food because you have to have rotation and you do plant leguminosas on such land. Because after all, we have a surplus of sugar production in the world because there are some protections for sugar productions both in Europe and here in the United States. And you do have a surplus of sugar that we cannot know what to do with it because of the protection we have on sugar productions. And these protection on sugar productions make ethanol production out of sugarcane in places that have access to those privileged markets in Europe and the United States, not producing ethanol, which is a consequence and an additional fact over food security. So our contribution to food security, if and when we could have additional markets, are very, 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 very clear. Not to talk about economic and social security. That's our problems and the problem of developing and underdeveloped countries. So this is an issue that we raise because it is a fantastic instrument for economic and social security, the biofuels out of sugarcane. The contribution that we can do under the tropical world, where the sun and the light makes possible this fantastic instrument of development, the sugarcane. It can be additional to whatever means of the second or third generation of ethanol production, whereas the use of cellulosic material, either through the different processes, chemical or thermochemical, could additionally put at least 120, 140 different countries producing ethanol. We do not compete. We producers of ethanol, from any feedstock, from anywhere in the world, we don't compete with each other. And that's something that people don't understand. We compete with gasoline. That's the thing. We have a market for gasoline that is, in gallon terms, some 400 billion gallons a year. We are producing 6 per 5, 6, 15, 18 billion gallons of ethanol. We could be producing, let's say, fantastically speaking, 50, 80, 20 years from now, putting it all every country, as against the 400 billion gallons figure for gasoline consumption. That's the enemy. We, producers of ethanol, more or less efficient, will have enough room for that. That is a proposition for a partnership on renewable energy. But for one fact: protectionism, tariff. Think about it. Thank you very much.
Jason, could you please go to... Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And I first want to apologize that Congressman Engel couldn't be here. Thank you for your invitation to him. He's not around now, but he wants to thank the Woodrow Wilson Center for its excellent work on Brazil. And thank you for having me speak.
Pleasure.
And we've talked about this a little bit during the conference so far, but the Obama administration seems like it's going to have its plate full already when it comes in with the financial meltdown, filling all the cabinet and sub-cabinet slots. They haven't even gotten to that yet. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, devising a new health care plan, and of course, energy. Oh, wait a minute. I think Latin America and Brazil did not seem to make that list. But on the one hand, that's a good and bad thing. It seems like the major crises in the world that we're going to face may not come from the Western Hemisphere, but on the other hand, that might mean that the region could again, and will likely again, get less attention, short shrift from an incoming administration, whether it was Democrat or Republican. It probably would still get that. But still, I'm hopeful because there are some serious people in the Obama transition team who know that this would be a mistake and want to re-engage with Latin America. But I also know, and I think we all know, that the crisis of the moment often gets priority over steady, long-term interests. So we'll have to stay tuned to see how the new administration acts toward Latin America. But it kind of brings me to the thought, what is the intersection of interests between that crisis of the moment, Latin America and Brazil, and the United States? And I think one key answer to that is energy. And I think that's come up a little bit, so I'm trying not to be repetitive. But we all know the dangers, and we've talked about this from United States over-reliance on oil, from greenhouse gases to energy security to wildly fluctuating prices. We've put ourselves in a perilous position. And it's in our interest, of course, to reduce our dependence on oil, improve our energy security by diversifying, especially toward renewables. So for that reason, my boss is Congressman Eliot Engel. He's the chair of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee, also the chair of the Brazil caucus in the House of Representatives, took a trip and led a trip of a bipartisan group of members to Brazil last year. We wanted to discuss and learn from Brazil's success in reducing its reliance on imported oil. Well, he was amazed. The members of our delegation were amazed. We could give them briefing memos all day long. We can have dutiful staff tell them what's going on all day long, and we did. And we could have them read books on this, but taking them there and showing them what has taken place in Brazil opened their eyes. And ever since, he's described to everyone who will listen how impressed he was with Brazil's achievements on biofuels, how he went to a fueling station, thank you, Joel, and saw what happens at the pump. He was amazed that virtually every car in Brazil, or 90% today, that are produced today, are flex fuel vehicles. Well, in the United States, only a small percentage of cars incorporate the flex fuel technology. For only $100 a car, adding flex fuel capabilities is actually one of the last true bargains in our pretty terrible economic environment. So what he'll tell you, and what he proselytizes to everyone who will listen, is that we in the United States need to learn from Brazil's success and to change our laws to ensure that most new cars in the United States are flex fuel vehicles. He has introduced a bill called the Open Fuel Standards Act to require that a large percentage of new cars in the United States, and ultimately a vast majority, will be flex fuel vehicles. As was mentioned, the cars in Brazil that are made by U.S. car companies are flex fuel vehicles, and there's no reason why they can't do that in the United States. We all realize that auto manufacturers here are having difficult times, but if we're going to bail them out, or even if we're not, flex fuel technology should be mandated just like seat belts or airbags or other things that are standard. Well, still, if we've had it tough with high oil prices, not right now, but if we've had it tough with high oil prices, the countries in the Caribbean and Central America have it even worse. In fact, 17 countries in our region are virtually 100% dependent on foreign sources of oil, mostly coming from Hugo Chavez. And that leads me to the leading area of cooperation, or energy cooperation, between Brazil and the United States. The U.S.-Brazil official cooperation, the U.S.-Brazil Memorandum of Understanding on Biofuels, which began and was signed by the two presidents in March 2007, is just the kind of policy to help promote clean, renewable alternatives to oil. With Brazil, we've selected 9 countries where we're trying to stimulate the development of a domestic biofuels sector. 7 of them are in the Western Hemisphere, and Central America and the Caribbean, and 2 are in Africa. On the one hand, this is an excellent program on all fronts. And it represents just the type of cooperation, practical, on-the-ground cooperation, not rhetoric as what was talked before, but this is practical, technical cooperation between Brazil and the United States. And as both of our countries are technological leaders in biofuels, it's critical that we're helping others in the region that need our help to diversify their energy portfolios. Yet, almost 2 years into the program, I'm somewhat concerned that the process of promoting biofuels in these countries has gone somewhat slower than we had hoped, although it has seemed to have advanced a little more rapidly in the last few months. Yet only a few $1 million have been spent by both countries on the program, and as we approach the second anniversary, I'm not sure if any biofuel production has actually begun. Congressman Engel plans to work with the new incoming Obama administration to encourage them to continue the program and to see what we can do about moving along a little bit faster. And in particular, shouldn't be me, I would like to hear a little bit more about the efforts to help Haiti, which is facing such tragedy, produce biofuel from jatropha, which could actually help them in a number of ways. But as you know, helping other countries is only one of the 3 legs of the three-legged stool that makes up the MOU. We're also working together to advance scientific research into biofuels, and a key agreement was signed between the United States National Renewable Energy Lab and Petrobras Center for Energy Research Development on October 3rd to accelerate development of the next generation of biofuels. And the final leg of that stool, the U.S. and Brazil are working together, as has been mentioned, to commoditize biofuels through cooperation on technical standards, and also to assess the biofuels' greenhouse gas emissions and benefits. Well, of course, as we've said, in Brazil, ethanol is made from sugarcane, in the United States from corn. And this has produced a great deal of debate about whether corn is the appropriate feedstock. I'll leave that for others, but it should suffice to say that we've greatly increased the amount of biofuels, and Joel's terrific charts have shown all this. And we've started to develop an industry and a network for renewables in this country. And by but one of the key points, though, is under the renewable fuel standard, by 2022, 21 of the 36 billion gallons mandated will have to be advanced biofuels. And these include cellulosic and a variety of other technologies. And this is where the U.S.-Brazilian cooperation on scientific research can enter the picture. If we're successful in developing an efficient means of creating cellulosic and other advanced biofuels, we will be able to dramatically reduce our dependence on oil and help other nations do the same. But the U.S. cannot only look to its domestic agricultural sector to produce biofuels that we consume in this country. And Joel talked all about this, so I'll skip over a little bit of the question of imports, except to say that he mentioned the kind of dyslexic tariff of the 54% tariff, which is supposed to be the same as the 45-cent credit to the blenders of the fuels. Congressman Engel is going to be introducing a bill called the Imported Ethanol Facilitation Act, which will equalize the tariff and the credit, whatever the level they will be. And we'll introduce that in the next Congress. That bill already exists, so we're going to be introducing it because the House sponsor, Congressman Mark Udall, is now Senator-elect Mark Udall. So we'll be introducing the bill for him. But our cooperation on biofuels doesn't end there. We stand together diplomatically around the world when countries attack biofuels as part of the food versus fuel debate. And it's critical that we continue to stand together. Even though we have different feedstocks, we need to stand together on this when we do face adversity. But not all of our cooperation between Brazil and the United States has been on biofuels. Petrobras is now a major player in oil drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. Its experience in deep drilling off of Brazil's coast has put it in a very strong position when bidding for rights to drill in blocks off the Gulf Coast. In fact, during the last couple of rounds, Petrobras was the winner of the largest number of blocks. And likewise, for the massive oil finds in Brazil, U.S. companies are finding a good market and an open regulatory system. So the challenge for the United States and the region and Brazil is to continue to closely cooperate at the highest levels and to continue to cooperate at the technical levels so we can work together. And Congressman Engel has also introduced a bill that was introduced in the Senate by Senator Richard Lugar, and I'll let Carl talk more about that, called the Western Hemisphere Energy Compact Act, which will expand cooperation and promote biofuels and other alternatives in the region. But the essence of the point being to help promote cooperation, stimulate development throughout the hemisphere. So I'd just like to conclude by saying this is a very exciting time for those of us who are interested in promoting U.S.-Brazil cooperation. And energy is a great place to start, and we've done good work already. But let's not let that be it. Brazil's moving on to a more important level in the world stage. As a regional great power, it wants to be on the Security Council and act globally. And that's good. And Brazil's work in Haiti is certainly to be commended as a critical step in that direction. But let's let this greater energy cooperation be a jumping-off point so our two nations can more closely coordinate and work together on a broader range of issues. So the challenge for our incoming administration will be not only to keep up the intensity and the good work, but to see how we can expand into other areas. Thank you.
Well, how do I do this? Going last, trying to keep it fresh. Should I take my jacket off? We always used to joke about Brazil during the last administration. It was like this pretty woman at the bar that you go and send a drink to. She'd accept it, and you'd send another drink, and she'd accept it. You'd go and talk to her, and she'd slap you. I think the issue
That's never
right
happened
now,
to you, though, right?
I think the issue, though, yeah, it never happened to me. I think the issue, though, is that the problem was the person sending the drinks. I think we have a new person sending the drinks now, and we hope that new suitor will receive a different kind of response, because there is a willingness, as we've seen here, to work more with Brazil, and I think that it's in both of our benefits. Now, I think a lot of folks have said a lot of good things here, and I'm going to try to focus on things that haven't been said. The environment in which we're in, as has been mentioned, will be a challenge to doing expansive things insofar as our foreign policy to the world as well as to the region. I think that Brazil, nevertheless, under the scope of energy, probably presents us with a better and more attractive set of circumstances that will motivate folks to want to do more. But at the end of the day, the context of our foreign policy in general will be fraught with challenges. The other issue that is starting to become more and more relevant in the region is the commodity prices and how commodity prices are decreasing, and the challenges that that's probably going to present to us in the region, and it will probably affect how we define priorities. I think a lot of the promises that governments are making to their constituencies are going to be tough to keep. So we're going to have to be dealing with some instability in some countries. Hopefully not Brazil. But with the fluctuating oil prices and given the vulnerability that the reliance on foreign fuel represents to us all, I think energy security is an area that the next administration is going to hold as a high priority. And lucky for us, the potential response or solution to this is in our hemisphere. Energy security is an advantageous platform upon which to strengthen our security and to build a new structure or framework for our relations with countries in the region as well, because the needs are clear and immediate. All parties have something to offer and something to gain. The need to attain genuine energy security with supplies sufficient to grow our economies and insulated from foreign manipulation has at long last become widely recognized. We in the Western Hemisphere are fortunate to have the means to bolster reliable trade in conventional energy sources, as well as create new sources of economic growth through wise use of renewable resources. But as we prepare for this new administration, and I think we've alluded a little bit to this MOU, this famous MOU that we believe was a good first step, nevertheless, it was a very, very modest step in our view. Senator, I guess this prompted us to try to create a framework, a much more ambitious framework, with regards to energy, biofuel promotion, and energy security in the region. The recent discovery of the two oil fields in Brazil also make it pretty obvious for us, and I know the title of this whole day session had to do with what are the prospects for better relations with Brazil. I think it's obvious. I mean, it's obvious to us that we need to be doing this. The question is if the political will is going to be out there, and if the money is going to be out there to do it. A joint energy program with Brazil would bring jobs and other economic benefits not only to Brazil but also in Latin America. It could serve as a cornerstone for our relationship with Latin America. But I think, borrowing what Brazil has demonstrated to us lately, Brazil's not looking just about the region. I mean, this is not Brazil concerned with what's happening with Hugo Chavez or what's happening in Argentina only. Brazil is interested in being a global player. And I think we need to be looking at Brazil as a global player. So when we talk about these issues with Brazil, we also should be talking about how to promote biofuels in other areas of the world, looking at the Chinese, looking at South Africa, looking at Japan. There's a lot that Brazil is doing with biofuels in Kenya. We're looking at a lot more like that. But we should also look at this relationship and how it can expand into other areas of cooperation like AIDS in Africa. Brazil has been very interested and very, I'd say, efficient insofar as looking at what they can do in Africa, what progress we can make at Doha. You know, we're talking about tariffs and tariff reductions and doing away with this protectionism. What more work can we do at Doha? Brazil was very, very constructive in the last meeting, and I think we'd like to see more of that. But I think we need to start working as partners and as equals, which is what I think the Brazilians are going to appreciate a lot more. And last, the UN Security Council reform, which is something that Brazil wants to look at. So I think that this provides a framework for that. On specifics, insofar as another issue that I think is going to be raised more and more now, this kind of relationship will allow for us to deal with the greater challenge of climate change, which I believe to be one of the focus areas of the new administration's energy policy. We heard that a lot from President-elect Obama. They've made some appointments that have been very constructive in that regard. This might prompt the Brazilian government to move aggressively in this area, and encourage the Lula government to assume a more proactive position on climate, away from just South-South relations, more into South or Brazil and industrialized countries. We need to be, or they want to be looking to the broader picture. We need to encourage them to do that. We need to be a partner in their efforts to do this. It was alluded that my boss has called for lifting the U.S. ethanol tariff. We have, and I think it was yesterday that Senator Daschle, or Secretary-to-be of Health Daschle, from a very key state in these issues, said the same thing. He wants to do away with the ethanol tariff. I mean, these are all very positive developments. Now, we have to put meat to the rhetoric, though. We have to come up with policies. And my boss came out with this bill, the Western Hemisphere Energy Compact, that provides a framework for that. And that's the kind of thing we would like to see the administration pursuing. We are going to be reintroducing this legislation as one of our priority bills, top 10 bills, when the new Congress gets back in session. And we want to try to really accelerate this relationship. We believe, insofar as not just the region, but this should be a foreign policy priority for the administration, period. I mean, this is, Brazil is an emerging market. They have a large economy. We're interested also in doing things like developing a tax treaty, which I believe is going to be very important for our consumers and for Brazilian consumers. So it's a big package. I know it's an ambitious approach, but I think it's a realistic approach. We want to deepen this partnership. We want to become closer. This type of partnership could help improve economic growth, create jobs, and promote stronger regional and hemispheric cohesion. In addition, cooperation on energy security in our hemisphere will help build our alliances and prevent conflict. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. We have time for a few short questions of the type that invites concise answers. So, yes.
Thank you. Pablo Reyes with the Center for Latin American Strategic Studies in Bogota, Colombia. Looking forward at the negotiations in Copenhagen a year from now, and I was just wondering how U.S.-Brazilian cooperation on energy can set the ground for those negotiations, given that there's cooperation on a whole array of issues going beyond biofuels into wind and energy efficiency and what will be probably a cap-and-trade system. How can the relations help set the ground, and also considering that if any developing country can lead the way, or an emerging market, and set example for other countries, is Brazil. So just wanted your take on that.
Who wants to take that?
Eu acho que você tocou num ponto bastante importante. Primeiro, quando nós observamos a matriz elétrica brasileira, você vê que já quase 90% é renovável. Quando você vê a matriz energética como um todo, você tem praticamente 45% renovável. Isso é uma condição que poucos países no mundo têm. É claro que quando nós falamos, por exemplo, em projeções para o plano 2030, que nós chamamos assim no Brasil, um plano de o nosso planejamento energético de longo prazo, né, uma visão prospectiva, você enxerga que aquele plano, quando eu falei de você incrementar 125 mil megawatts, nós estamos considerando todas as fontes entrando. E nós estamos considerando também 10% de eficiência energética, de redução. Quer dizer, isso, para os senhores terem uma ideia, esses 10% equivaleria a uma usina de Itaipu inteira, que se pretende com eficiência energética até 2030. Então, é claro que nós consideramos isso importante. É claro que eu acho que o desenvolvimento da indústria eólica, do potencial eólico, o Brasil tem um potencial eólico muito grande. Agora, sempre você pesa de acordo com a oportunidade e o custo da fonte. Se você tem fontes mais baratas e renováveis, você vai utilizando prioritariamente. Mas é claro que nós ainda recentemente, nós fizemos um programa de governo e contratamos cerca de 1.000 megawatts, ou coisa assim, eólica, e pretendemos fazer, por exemplo, um leilão agora no início do ano que vem, contratando mais eólica. Então, eu acho que para um país que mostra crescimentos nessa taxa, tem oportunidade para todas as fontes, e eu acredito que parcerias aí nessa área de eficiência energética dos Estados Unidos, acho que tem um campo muito grande, e além dessas outras fontes, como os Estados Unidos têm desenvolvido muito, a solar heliotérmica, que também eu acho que é interessante aumentar, até para essa visão aí de longo prazo, né?
Joel.
If I could just say very briefly, I think, and now speaking on behalf of, sort of the private sector in Brazil, from the Brazilian ethanol industry, I mean, we look at Copenhagen as a very, very important event a year from now. Reality is my colleague is right now in Poland. In the current meetings, we were in Bali, and we are committed from the private sector of Brazil, trying to rally the private sector to understand that this is a critical issue. Brazil has a lot to gain from this. Why? Because of what the minister just said. Now, I'll say another thing we're going to have to do. This is for all of Brazil. The only way there can be real cooperation is if Brazil makes a real meaningful proposal and binding proposal in terms of deforestation reduction. What specific actions? And so, the government Brazil has heard from us. I think the government Brazil is going to act on it, but it's going to be critical. And if I would say, if there's one issue that, when you look at the next administration, one issue that Brazil and U.S. can work together, it may come surprise to you that I would say that it's really climate change. This is the area where the United States needs Brazil, and Brazil needs to have some, room to maneuver. And if the two of them can agree, doesn't have to be announced publicly, but that in 12 months that they will be standing together in Copenhagen, we may well have a deal, because the big challenge in Copenhagen is not going to be in the Americas. It's going to be in Asia.
Eduardo.
And just to confirm what Joel is saying, I think there is no more important issue at the table today than this one. The private sector in Brazil, especially the sugarcane industry, is keen on that, and we are participating very actively on the discussions. We do have a problem, although, politically speaking, there has been a known position of the Brazilian government as regards commitments. And I think that the whole issue in Copenhagen, or at least an important issue in Copenhagen, will be that kind of things. Are our government prepared to do so? And that's the role of the private industry. We do have a lot to gain, especially because of the fantastic experience we have had and we are having with our program in ethanol. on renewables. It is a fantastic instrument for mitigation of CO2 emissions. But we do face problems that we are working very hard. But I do think that there is a fantastic collaboration field with the U.S. on this issue.
And as we have that debate in Brazil, be sure that we are going to bring it here, and we want to focus our program of 2009 in a major way on that issue of climate change, preparing for Copenhagen. One question here.
Roseanne Franco, PFC Energy. We've heard some very positive developments with regard to ethanol, and I was wondering if we could hear a little bit more about oil, and actually had a particular question to Deputy Minister Zimmerman. We know Brazil has made very clear indications that they're going to respect current contracts. I was wondering if you could comment more about the future regulatory framework for subsalt. There's an enormous amount of noise about a possible new national oil company, different types of contracts, and I was wondering if you could signal one way or another what your expectations are. Thank you.
Bom, primeiro, eu acho que é bastante interessante a pergunta. Quando você observa, é normal que qualquer país descubra reservas assim, pelo menos potencialmente, bastante grandes, e que não analise com uma discussão bastante grande se antes ele trabalhava com uma perspectiva de autossuficiência, reservas da ordem de 12, 14, 15 bilhões de barris, e mantendo para 20 anos aí a relação consumo-produção. Quando aparece o pré-sal e as perspectivas que existem no pré-sal, obrigam o governante e a própria sociedade brasileira a pensar e com aquele ponto de equilíbrio que eu comentei ainda há pouco. Primeiro, nós temos os contratos vigentes lá, tanto na bacia de Campos, já que ocorre ali numa pequena parte pré-sal, que era no pós-sal, né, que vai permitir quem tem a concessão em chegar ao pré-sal. Mas, ao mesmo tempo, você precisa pensar que, primeiro, tem sentido naquela área de 800 a 200 quilômetros, que é onde tem a perspectiva aí dessas grandes reservas abaixo da camada de sal, tem sentido colocar lá como exploração de fronteira nova? Tem sentido você... Então você tem que analisar como é que você trata agora aquela área com aquelas condições. Isso não significa que você vá mudar o marco regulatório do petróleo no Brasil. Não é essa a ideia do governo. A ideia é tratar de forma que você venha trazer os melhores resultados para a sociedade brasileira e sem pensar simplesmente em vamos explorar tudo que der ali, passar a produzir, sei lá, se tiver reservas para isso, mas 10 bilhões, vamos entrar para 10 milhões de barris diários, vamos entrar para a OPEP, vamos vender. Não é isso. Eu acho que a ideia é que você... o Brasil já é um país diferente de outros aí que você tem, que está num estágio industrial, que tem que tem que tomar as medidas de forma bastante coerente, com bastante inteligência, e o país tem condições disso, e mantendo a característica que ele vem mantendo, que é o que eu falei, né? É o país que mais recebe investimento estrangeiro no setor de energia, de todos os países envolvidos. E só para vocês terem uma ideia, dentro dos BRIC, o país capta praticamente 46% dos investimentos externos que estão ocorrendo nos BRIC. O Brasil é em torno de 40 e poucos por cento nessa área de energia. Então é um aspecto bastante positivo. Agora, existe uma comissão que foi criada pelo governo, que está participando o ministro de Minas e Energia, a Casa Civil e outros ministérios, e que vão apresentar uma proposta para o presidente da República sobre possíveis, de como você tratar essa região que você já sabe que tem um grande potencial de petróleo, né? Agora, só para vocês terem uma ideia, a sequência que está se dando as rodadas de licitações em outras áreas, já que o Brasil ele conhece muito pouco das suas bacias sedimentares. Nós temos praticamente 6 milhões de quilômetros quadrados com bacias sedimentares, e você hoje está explorando uma parte muito pequena, né? E o conhecimento, então, é muito pequeno. Então, nós continuamos com aquelas as rodadas de licitações, que tem sido um sucesso, tem várias empresas americanas participando, inclusive, de prospectar fronteira nova e, ao mesmo tempo, aquelas que você precisa amadurecer. Agora, o pré-sal, como é alguma coisa totalmente diferente, está esperando a conclusão do resultado, que eu não tenho aqui, do trabalho desse grupo, para então ser apresentado ao presidente. A expectativa é que termine esse mês ainda esse trabalho e que venha a ser apresentado para o presidente da República e depois para ver o que é que seria providenciado.
Yeah, before we go to the last question, I'd like to tell you that Ambassador Tom Shannon, the Assistant Secretary of State for the Western Hemisphere, has joined us, and we're going to do the last question and then a very brief break, and then we go to the last session. So I think the last questions is right there behind. Oh, check.
I'm Mark Longevan, American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees in the University of Maryland. Just an intersecting question. The assistant or the deputy minister didn't talk much about the natural gas, both domestic production and importation of natural gas. We also know in terms of agriculture, not so much in sugarcane, but in soy and corn in Brazil and other crops, there's a dependence on imported fertilizer, in particular nitrogen. Nitrogen being an element of which natural gas may be the most efficient primary source. Can you speak about that intersection and how possibly the United States or other countries around the world may assist Brazil in meeting that challenge?
Você tocou num ponto muito importante. O Brasil, como um dos maiores produtores de alimento do mundo, com o maior potencial aí de agrícola, a parte de fertilizantes é chave. Então, realmente existe essa preocupação. Quando você fala no NPK, né, nitrogênio, potássio e fósforo, tem grupos interministeriais aí trabalhando para, primeiro, aumentar a produção de potássio e do próprio fósforo. O Brasil é um grande importador desses. E, por outro lado, tem reservas e tem potenciais aí a ser explorado. E quando você fala no caso do nitrogênio, e aí falando no gás especificamente aí que você comentou, o Brasil hoje deve ter uma reserva da ordem de 11, 12 TCF, trilhões de pés cúbicos de gás. Isso dá mais ou menos para 20, 25 anos, o atual volume de consumo. Nós somos um grande importador de gás da Bolívia, né? Hoje em torno de 30 milhões de metros cúbicos por dia. E, por outro lado, quando nós voltamos a falar aí do pré-sal, lá existe uma grande potencialidade, né, de gás, já aprovados por testes e tal, de você vir a ter gás, e de forma até que nós trabalhamos com perspectivas de aumentar essa participação do gás na nossa matriz. Então, tanto existe perspectivas de reservas de gás, nós temos na Amazônia, nós temos na região da bacia do São Francisco e outras áreas que tem no Brasil, e hoje nós temos um consumo aí da ordem de 50 milhões de metros cúbicos dia, né? Nós importamos 30 e produzimos 20, e sabemos que já há um tempo que nós estamos fazendo nessas rodadas de prospecção de novas áreas aí de petróleo e gás. Nós priorizamos áreas de gás já na 7ª rodada, que foi há 2 anos atrás, na 8ª também tinha, justamente para isso, para você aumentar, já que você sabe que o gás vai ocupar um lugar importante na nossa matriz energética e tem esse lado estratégico, que é a produção do nitrogênio, que você tanto pode ser via o gás, como já vem vários grupos privados aí até estudando aqui nos Estados Unidos, a parte também de carvão. O nosso carvão ele tem muito enxofre, né? E você trabalhando com tecnologias que já utilizam aqui utilizadas aqui nos Estados Unidos, de forma que você poderia também aumentar essa produção aí. Mas gás, ele realmente vai ter uma participação e é chave aí para essa parte para a agricultura também.
Well, I would like to thank the members of this panel for a wonderful discussion. Now, I don't know much about baseball, but this break should be much more like the 7th inning stretch. Is that right? So, if you're leaving the